Hello everyone, welcome back to the show. My name's Dan, this is Exploder, and I have another episode just for you. First of all, I want to say thank you to everybody who's supporting on Facebook and Instagram and what have you. We're a small podcast, but the people that have come on are very passionate and like it and follow on Facebook and look at the memes I make and all the extra videos we're doing with Frank and all those things like that. So I want to thank you for all of you. I think we're a little over 200 now on the Facebook page. I think it's 212 if I had to guess. Thank you guys for being, I want to grow this podcast. I'm going to get better and bigger. I'm not unrealistic in my expectations. I don't think it's going to be the next big thing in the world. It'd be cool if it was, but I'm going to make the show I'm going to make, and if people like it, good for them, and if they don't, well, then the show ain't for you, and that's okay. In this episode, I want to talk about something that's often overlooked in pro wrestling. Things that, I don't know, just don't seem to make the cut when you think about pro wrestling. Everyone thinks about the pageantry. Everyone talks about, video games and all these things I've talked about before. Action figures and all these different schools of thought, I guess. But in this one, I wanted to talk about pro wrestling schools, one in particular, but I'll get to that. Everyone talks about now is the WWE Performance Center, which is a one-stop shop where they get people to come in who don't have a background and try out, football stars and what have you who transfer into pro wrestling. It's a gym. It takes people from the independents. Recently, a guy from Lima, Ohio, of all people, a guy named Zach Wentz, who used to work for Impact Wrestling, who actually used to do ring crew in Lima, Ohio for War Wrestling, and Desmond Xavier, Alex Zane, are the three off the top of my head, who have recently signed. Those guys all have independent backgrounds and are now at the WWE Performance Center. And the goal, of course, is to eventually, work the house shows and eventually end up on NXT television, and then hopefully, or maybe not so hopefully, end up on the main roster on Raw and or SmackDown. But really, it doesn't matter which show because you're making money by that point. The thing about the Performance Center is, it is literally, like I said, it is a one-stop shop, but this is not the first of its kind. WWE's developmental system, which I really want to go into, I probably maybe go into a full episode on its own, because there's a history there of what became the developmental system. The end result of NXT was not the first draft. It wasn't even the first handful of drafts. And it goes back to companies like OVW, Deep South Wrestling, and before that HWA, and even Universal Pro Wrestling in California. I'll get into that another time. But no, when I'm talking about this one, I want to talk about, and this particular one is the WCW Power Plant, the first promotion training camp of its kind back in WCW back in the early 90s, and existed up until its closure.
This is the Power Plant in Atlanta. It's the WCW's training facility for professional wrestlers. And once a month, the Power Plant holds open tryouts for its program.
We are looking for athletes who can be part of the future of the WCW. About 10 or 15% of the ones that come through the door will actually make it through to the end. The wrestling business today is a very cosmetic. We're looking for people very well built physically. We're looking for people with good attitude. We're looking for people with heart. You've got to have heart in this business. You have to be tough enough to have something to pull from when times get tough.
Everybody up!
Kind of underestimated professional wrestling. I thought it was just had to learn how to take falls. I didn't realize these guys were in such great physical condition.
Everybody up!
I've been through college football, pro football, all kinds of different leagues. It's a different kind of conditioning. It's a whole different ball game. These are professional athletes. They really are, and my hat's off to them. I respect them.
This by far is the hardest thing I've ever done. I have to tell my buddies in baseball, don't ever cry to me about how tough baseball is. Here, you have pain involved.
15 new recruits joined the class this morning. Half will be gone by noon.
It used to be incredibly hard to get into wrestling, so if you got in, you were often being trained by either A, someone who would take the chance on training you, which was few and far between, individuals who would take someone under their wing, teach them the style, and then they would go onto a territory and do the best they could. What you'd also see during the days were the promoter-led schools. Vern Gagne's farm, famously in Minnesota, would bring out some notable students like the Iron Sheik and many, many more. I mean, that's a list that I don't even know if I could put them all. I mean, they might put on the screen on the video version. And of course, the Hart Dungeon, which put out every Hart brother, including other talents like Chris Benoit, Chris Jericho, and so on and so forth. Really talented guys, Larry Cameron, Bad News Allen, and so on and so forth. A lot of great talent coming out of just the Hart Dungeon, which of course was in the basement of the Hart family house. And of course, Stu Hart ran Stampede Wrestling, so again, it's promoter-led. Then there's the Dory Funk senior students. I mean, Terry Funk and Dory Funk Jr. There was also guys like Dusty Rhodes coming out of that school, Bruiser Brody, Tully Blanchard. So many different talents coming out of the Dory Funk Senior. Again, a promoter sort of ran his own school and ran it to bring in new talent into his own territory. The first really big, I mean, I don't know if he's never a big star, but the first big trainer, when you think about it, was guys like Eddie Sharkey. Eddie Sharkey had a lot of students. I mean, name a guy in the 80s, Eddie Sharkey probably trained them. Sharkey would train guys from Bob Backlund to, again, Larry Cameron, Sean Davari, Barry Darso. Even a manager like Paul Ellering used to be in the ring. Mike Enos. I mean, I could keep going on and on and on. John Nord, Lenny Lane. These are guys that were all trained by one guy named Eddie Sharkey. But again, we were talking about training happening for individuals. An individual or a promoter would have a set of students and it'd be for their own. The idea of the general wrestling trainer was sort of really not much of a thing. Al Snow famously told a story where Ole and Gene Anderson would hold fake tryouts for Georgia Championship Wrestling and basically use an excuse to get money from them and then beat the crap out of them. Tire them out, get in the ring, beat them up, teach them nothing, and send them on their way. That's not a way to get into the business. It's not a way to train a guy to get in the business. But unfortunately, you were either trained by a legit person or you were trained by a guy who was just basically beating you up and taking your money. The problem was, because the business was so closed off, there was no way of knowing that. The first real wrestling school, the first real, big time wrestling school was Larry Sharp's Monster Factory. Larry Sharp, of course, is a famous wrestler, did a lot of work in America, but a lot of work in Japan. And his first big student that people remember is Bam Bam Bigelow. Bam Bam Bigelow, of course, would have his debut match at Studio 54, which was, by the way, being promoted and photographed or whatever by a young Paul Heyman, if you can believe that. That's a hell of a story. The guy, basically, Heyman told the story was the original photographer got drunk and caused the ruckus. Heyman, who was young, was there doing other things, and then convinced them to let him be the photographer. And eventually that led to him promoting a show at Studio 54, and I believe they gave basically a fake award to Ric Flair. They wanted to be Hulk Hogan, and Hulk Hogan was just too big of a star, I guess, and they ended with Ric Flair. But it also featured the debut of Bam Bam Bigelow, who was Larry Sharp's star student.
That's right, it's Larry Sharp. So don't sit there with them stupid looks on your faces wondering what I'm doing on the CWA Wrestling Channel. No, I'm not in New York. No, I'm not in Tokyo. I'm in Memphis. And you want to know why I'm in Memphis? I don't want to be here. I've been all over the world and I've been able to avoid coming to Memphis. But Jerry Lawler had to do something to a very good Italian friend of mine, Mr. Dennis Carluzza. Now, I owe that man a favor, and he's calling it in. He makes me offers I can't refuse, so now I've got to be here. And Lawler, you're going to pay. Look at this man that I brought here. I'm telling you, ladies, send your kids out of the room if you don't want them to get scared. And if you want to sleep tonight, you get out of the room, too. Because I'm going to show you something you've never seen before in your life. I want you to take a look at Bam Bam Bigelow, the beast from the East, the man that I'm taking to Memphis, Tennessee. And he's going to start kicking with size 16 boots. And he's going to start stomping with 24-inch calves. And he's going to start banging knees and thighs that are 30 inches big with a 40-inch waist and a 52-inch chest. And that's nothing. And the reason you haven't seen his face, this man is so mean his own mother hates him. I don't even like to look at him. But I'm not in this for what I like. I'm in it for bucks. I want you to take a look at what this man is, what he does. Don't forget this face. You're going to be seeing it during the day. During the night. You're going to see it on the street. And Jerry Lawler, your nightmare is just starting. You, and I know how you are, Lawler. You're going to send a bunch of phony geeks in the ring and say he's got to work his way to the top. Well, we'll just smack them and ask for you, too. So this is what we're going to do. Take a look at this face. Do you think you stand a chance against a man like this? You're a fool. Look at those flames. We're coming to get you.
Now, this Larry Sharp's Monster Factory would become a major training facility in the area, and it would put together other talents such as Raven, Balls Mahoney, Barry Hardy, The Big Show, Chris Candido, Chris Harris, D'Lo Brown, The Godfather. I mean, it goes on and on and on, where Larry Sharp's Monster Factory became this big thing. Now, often Larry Sharp was the name on the as Raven told the story, was Larry Sharp was the name on the factory, he was the name on the school, but sometimes he wouldn't be training because he would be in Japan actually working, because he was still a working wrestler at the time. So it would be something where sometimes he'd be the one training you, and sometimes it'd be guys he worked with or he trusted, and so on and so forth. So I keep saying so on and so forth. I need to quit doing that. Wow. Also, a fun one here is one of the graduates of Larry Sharp's Monster Factory, of course, is Virgil. So you can't bat 1,000. But what does that have to do with anything? What does that have to do with the topic of the promotion? I've been going about 8 minutes now, and you're wondering, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it really talks about the nature of wrestling and the nature of wrestling schools. Wrestling was opening up in the 80s. It was still territories. The territories were on their way out. WWE was becoming this big thing. With Hulkamania and all this, but wrestling itself was still, it was closed, but it was slowly opening up. And when Larry Sharp's Monster Factory was that first one where it was like, if you came in and you paid your money, he would legitimately train you and teach you to get into the business. And he would do these things. He wasn't necessarily just if you worked for the promoter or if you were in a very closed, small group of people. It was one of those things where if you came in and you believed in what you were doing and you worked hard at it and you paid your money, he would train you, or someone associated with him would train you, and you would actually get into you'd at least have the fundamentals to get into the pro wrestling business. Like I said, everyone I mentioned were people that weren't necessarily the most well connected. Raven, of course, I keep going back to Raven, but Raven, who came from he had a college career, came from the military, and then he got into college. He was not necessarily a guy who was well connected. He wasn't related to anybody in particular, but he was able to get in and train and learn the business and end up wrestling for feels like 100 years now. Same with Bam Bam Bigelow. Same with guys like King Kong Bundy, who was a trainee, Tony Atlas, and guys like that were able to get in. Wrestling was opening up in that way. And of course, there's the New Japan Dojo, which is a whole different thing. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not a huge, I like it, but I'm not, as far as the history goes, I'm not a huge in the history of New Japan or Japanese wrestling in general. I've gone over it somewhat, but I don't know every single detail. I know there are people out there who are farther into it than I am. But maybe one day I'll do an episode on that. But that brings us to the power plant. The WWE power plant was something started by Jody Hamilton, who was, of course, the Masked Assassin. He opened a training center in 1989 in Lovejoy, Georgia. I cannot imagine what that city looks like. I'm not even going to start. In 1991, it became the official school of WCW and relocated to Jonesboro, Georgia. Don't know where that is. And then eventually, it would move into, I believe it's Smyrna. I believe when WCW moved from CNN Towers, they moved to a nondescript office building. I believe it's Smyrna, Georgia. I could be wrong on that. And the offices were here, and WCW power plant was in the back. Like, there was a whole area that was for the WCW power plant. And there were photos, and on the video version, I'm going to show you some of these photos where you're talking about, this was, if you look at the WWE Performance Center, the training facility, you're talking about multiple rings and lighting and backdrops and, an area to do promos and posters from past events and all these things. This is what WCW Power Plant looked like, and there's a lot of photos of it. And this was the first of its kind. Everywhere else, if you were in the Monster Factory, even, I've never been there, but I can't imagine production-wise the Monster Factory had that many. I mean, like, famously, there's so many people that worked there, but I cannot imagine it was a building they used to rent and had a ring and, if you were lucky, maybe a camera and things like that. I mean, I trained I'm not famous. Anyway, I trained in what was an old, mushroom factory. It was a mushroom factory in Lima, Ohio, and it was an old mushroom factory, and it was turned into truck bays. So they put up these brick walls in between them and put garage doors. We were in one of the truck bays, and it was just enough. We had an 18 by 18 ring, and it just fit in the truck bay, and right up at the end. So one side. So if you did something where you ran around the ring, you had to go out the one side. You couldn't actually go all the way around the ring because there was no room. And that's what a lot of wrestling schools used to be. Like I said, Vern Gagne, if I remember correctly, he had a gym, he had a ring in his barn. And the Hart family house didn't have a ring. I mean, they had one outside, but they didn't have one in the basement. It was just wrestling mats because Stu Hart was teaching you the wrestling holds, not necessarily the how to do a flying crossbody. But the WCW power plant was set up explicitly to be a training facility. I don't know exactly what Jody Hamilton had in mind. I mean, he set up a school, it became bigger and had more rings and all these different things. once WCW, it became the official spot of WCW. The school was famous for a couple things that are different from pro wrestling, unlike the Monster Factory and later training schools. The WCW Power Plant did not have tuition. I know many famous schools were, $1,500 to get through and things like that. He didn't, but also it was understood that people that were trained there were trained, A, because they passed a tryout, and I'll get to that, and B, already had some kind of basic fundamentals. Now, this would change later, as you would eventually end up with guys who had no wrestling background, guys like Bill Goldberg famously, who passed the tryout and then eventually got trained and became, in his case, one of the biggest in the wrestling business. But these were very rare. The school itself is not considered a great wrestling school. It's not a knock on anybody. Jody Hamilton, Kevin Nash famously remarked that Jody Hamilton's age, because even by this point, Jody Hamilton was a manager in WCW. He was an older guy, and it limited the kind of stuff he could do. Now, it would produce guys like Diamond Dallas Page, who started wrestling at 35 years old. I'm 36, and I can imagine starting wrestling at 36. I don't know. It can be done, obviously. Kevin Nash, Marcus Bagwell, Van Hammer, and things like that. But it wasn't necessarily known for being a great school that produced high quality talent. I mean, I could list the people I've mentioned earlier. We're talking about, the Hart Family Dungeon, the Monster Factory, or even Vern Gagne's camp. I could name, 15, 20 people who became big stars. WCW's Power Plant was not necessarily known for that. It was known for a couple guys. Like I said, Diamond Dallas Page, Kevin Nash, Goldberg. There's very few actually main top guys. Now, there'd be a lot of guys who came out of the school, and I'll get to that, but not necessarily guys who were big stars, let's put it that way. Not that people who would be in the business 15, 20 years later. Certainly not many world champions, with the exception of the three I mentioned, with being Nash, Page, and Goldberg, but not really known for being a great school, just being a school that was attached to WCW, and that's why you wanted to go there, because you wanted to be seen by people so that maybe you could debut on Monday Nitro. Power Plant itself, as we commonly know it now, didn't start until about 1995. Now, that was the year WCW took over this training facility, where before it was Jody Hamilton sort of being in charge, and he'd bring in Mike Graham, and WCW became the proprietor, I guess. WCW started charging $2,500 in tuition, because before that, WCW had actually covered the cost. So anything that it would have cost to rent the building or what have you to run the school, and of course you got to pay Jody Hamilton and Mike Graham. Training someone for free is stupid. But yeah, so they started paying. They used to pay it. WCW paid it, and then they started charging dues $2,500 around 1995. Basically, I don't know if it was test. I think part of it was to test dedication, but also it's one of those things where if you can get someone to pay it, because you could charge, like I said, up to $1,000 more than the average, because this was a promotion directly connected to WCW, who at the time in 95 were not a huge promotion, but they had Hulk Hogan, and they were a TV presence. They weren't winning, but they were a TV presence.
Life magazine called it the Harvard of professional wrestling. ABC's Good Morning America gave it a rave review. The WCW Power Plant will help you reach your potential. They'll train your body, work on your moves, and motivate you to be your best. The WCW Power Plant, the #1 wrestling facility in the world. Call now to set up a tryout at 404-351-4959.
So that's why the shift happened there. People were willing to do it. They're willing to pay that because it was, again, a chance to get looked at by the right people. Also in 1995, which is very interesting, which I didn't know before this, was that the WCW Power Plant, or WCW as a whole, worked at a developmental deal with the Memphis-based USWA, which, like I've covered before, is the last wrestling territory. And then trainees, including a man named Ron Reese, who became the Yeti, the Supergiant Ninja, and then eventually a vehicle for Billy Kidman, were sent to Memphis. And then they got some in-ring and television experience without having to go on WCW television, and they were in USWA, who had a syndication deal in that area. They would also, very uniquely, they would actually work in smaller promotions. The Georgia-based Peach State Wrestling would work with guys like Ron Reese and Bobby Walker. WCW would run house shows in small Georgia towns, and the trainees would actually work on those house shows to get experiences to work in front of really small crowds, 100, 200, 300 people, but it was a chance to get them in front of a live crowd, because you can't learn a whole lot when you're in a wrestling school. When you're in a training facility, you're not learning a whole lot if you're just working with the same guys and you're working in front of the trainers. It's fine, but once you start working in front of a live crowd, you need that reaction. And they knew that. And of course they knew that. WCW also signed developmental deals with promotions like the HWA, Heartland Wrestling Alliance in Cincinnati, Ohio, run by Les Thatcher. They would also have a deal with NWA Wildside, and would often, a lot of the talent would be included in Dusty Rhodes promotion Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling, which was founded in the year 2000, also based in Georgia. Talent like Robbie Rage, Ray Lloyd, who would become Glacier, also were famously people who trained at the WCW Power Plant, would work for WCW, and would often work in a lot of these promotions after the fact. Power Plant trainees were often jobbers on B and C shows, Saturday Night, Worldwide, so on and, why do I keep saying so on and so forth? I keep saying it. I don't know. I can't help myself. Guys like Chuck Palumbo, Robbie Rage, Kenny Chaos, and the like. Some guys would, if they were good enough, I guess, they'd get on TV and they would get steamrolled by Bill Goldberg, who himself was a WCW trainee, but he actually got over. And it also served a dual role, which also the Performance Center does in many ways. Power Plant was also used not only to train new talent, but it gave people to bring veteran wrestlers in and to rehab, to get back in the ring when they're not, if they get injured and they're coming back, they were able to work out stuff in a closed environment instead of going out there completely fresh right after an injury. It's also a place where talent could train for matches. Carl Malone, Dennis Rodman, guys who had no real wrestling experience, were able to go to the Power Plant and work over their matches before, again, making a live TV debut. They could actually work some stuff out with people who knew what they were doing. And also where people could be trained for things like Ready to Rumble, and guys who were being trained in things that they weren't necessarily prepared for or have a wrestling background. They would often use the Power Plant for these kinds of things. They would also use it to develop Cruiserweight division in 1999, with bringing young guys in and working them again in that closed environment to work out their stuff, so that when they went to a live crowd, they had more of a solid background instead of just being put out there cold in front of a live crowd. So that's it's very good use of the space. So you're not only training new guys, but you're also taking people who need a little help, or guys who are already on your roster, and giving a little rehab to work on injuries or things like that. And that was actually very smart. The Power Plant would famously have 3-day tryouts once a month, applicants between the age of 18 and 29, and if the applicants made it through the tryout phase, they would earn an invitation to join the school at $3,000 for 6 months of training. That's, again, a little different to do a time trial than just paying the tuition and training until you're ready. So this was $3,000 for 6 months. Applicants had to be at least 5'9" and at least 175 pounds. Again, they were looking for an athletic build, which I don't think 5'9" might be a little harder. 175 pounds, if you're in the ring, I don't think it's hard to find guys like that. It was during these tryout phases where some of the criticism of the Power Plant came along. Some people have said that the tryouts, the idea of the tryouts was to get these guys in to see what they could do. And what happened was, because they're in what's essentially Atlanta, there were a lot of guys who were washing out of the NBA or the NFL. I don't know about Major League Baseball, but I know football and basketball, guys would wash out, or they would do a couple seasons and they'd hurt themselves. And then they would just decide, well, I'm already in Atlanta, let's try out this wrestling thing. Because they didn't really have enough respect for it. They just thought it was something you could come in and just be great at. The part of the tryouts were to, quite frankly, break these guys down. That's what these trials did. They broke them down. They ran them through calisthenics. First, primarily, they wanted to see if you were athletic. I mean, it's one thing if you want to be the biggest star in the world, but you don't have a background and you're not trained, you're not athletically trained, and you're not in a position where you can actually do something. That's fine if you dream, but if you're not actually able to run the ropes for long enough, or you're not able to actually do what they need you to do, well, that's fine and dandy, but here's the door. So ostensibly, the plan was to see if they were athletic, but it also had an underside. The underside, which I think Dwayne Bruce, who wrestled as Buddy Lee Parker, who was a constant jobber for WCW, and I'm not saying that derisively, I'm saying it's a fact. He was Braun the Leprechaun, he was Sergeant Buddy Lee Parker, he was on the State Patrol, which was a jobber tag team they did on the B&C shows. But it was also the thing where he would put them through exercise, and run them down to the point where he saw it as a badge of honor if they vomited. Just to run them out. They couldn't breathe. They were having trouble incredible movement. And then when all that was done, at the end of it, and I don't remember if you did or not, maybe you touched the ring, but you probably didn't. It was one of those things where, do Hindu squats, do sit-ups, do push-ups, do pull-ups, do this strenuous exercise of the nth degree, but it was to see, A, if you were athletic enough, and B, quite frankly, it ran off a lot of guys. It ran off guys who didn't really want it, who thought they were just gonna, screw around and get into this whole wrestling thing. And Dwayne Bruce and the people involved, I think in a way they wanted to keep kayfabe, and they wanted to run those guys off so that they didn't have a group full of, quite frankly, ultimate warriors who thought because they had a good body, they could just become the next biggest thing in the world. This would, of course, be shown in the BBC documentary by Louis Theroux, which featured Dwayne Bruce wearing him out to the point where Theroux vomited, which, again, Dwayne Bruce took pride in. Now, this was partially kayfabe, as Theroux was being a real journalist and asking the question of whether wrestling was fake and things like that. As, anyone who isn't from wrestling getting in a camera, the first thing you ask is, is wrestling fake? Whenever David Schultz isn't in the room, famously, wore him out, and it's something that, and again, on the Facebook page, I'm going to actually show this. I'm going to actually, if I can find a clip of that, I'm going to put that out, and it's very interesting, and you get another good look of what the building looked like and what was going on. Also, the kind of trainer that Dwayne Bruce was. Here's other trainers would include C.W. Anderson, Ole Anderson, Bobby Eaton, Nora Greenwald, who is famously known as Molly Holly, Deborah Maselli or Medusa, Mike Winter, Craig O'Malley, and unfortunately, Pat Tanaka. Now, the criticisms of the training style. There was a very strong criticism of the power plant. Like I said, it's not necessarily known for being a big training camp. It didn't put out a lot of great talent. It put out some, and some guys would work there. Guys like Hard Work Bobby Walker, Hard Body Harrison, Robbie Rage, Kenny Chaos would be a tag team champion somehow, Ron Reese, Dime Dallas Page, Goldberg, Kevin Nash, Kevin Nash was a very early trainee, as was Dime Dallas Page. Marcus Bagwell, Van Hammer, that's a regret. Guys like that. But it's also, in general, once the school became famous, once it became the training camp for WCW, it's not known for being a big camp. It's not known for putting out a lot of quality guys. One big criticism of it was, and while earlier in the time, Jody Hamilton was criticized because he couldn't get in the ring and work with guys. But at this point, they had guys like Pez Whatley, Terry Taylor, Paul Orndorff, Dwayne Bruce, Mike Graham, so many guys who could get in the ring and actually work with you. So that wasn't the criticism. The criticism was Dwayne Bruce was the leader of this. He was the head trainer. And once the trials were over and you ran off all the NFL guys or whatever, the problem was some people felt like he kept going that way. He kept going with wearing you out and wearing you out and wearing you out, to the point where guys who were legit and guys who had came in and were actually working hard and were trying to do their best and weren't just, ex-NFL guys trying to latch onto another career, were getting injured. You're protecting the business, but if your job is to get them ready and get them ready for television and give them new ideas and give them new characters and things like that, and your style is getting guys injured quicker than they're getting on television, that's a problem. This is the over-reliance of calisthenics, which is a good idea to have guys at that level, but it was also something where it would blow them up. And by the time you're blown up and you get in the ring, you've done how many, Hindu squats and all these different things, and then you get in the ring, you're so blown up, you're not thinking about what you're learning. And if you're already blown up, well, good luck. You try to do a hip toss when your arms barely move. If you're already in that situation and you're trying to do a move, you're not really going to do it right because your body can't handle doing it. It's one of those things where it's a delicate balance, and that's the argument against the WCW power plant. Was quite frankly, too often the over-reliance was put on how well you can do push-ups and not how well you can do a body slam, which is sort of the opposite of what you want when you're talking about a pro wrestling school. Now, some argue that Bill DeMott would bring this style to WWE, which is why he was subsequently fired by WWE as a trainer twice. Bill DeMott came from the power plant and was he was the guy who was working in the indies, who came into the power plant, worked hard there, and became a regular on the roster. But some people say he took that style of, things that are not necessarily as important as learning the moves, and he brought it to WWE, and why WWE, quite frankly, fired him on 2 separate occasions. Because it's that old school mentality and not necessarily how we're going to do the moves, it's whether or not he can get you to vomit, or whether you can do 1,000 push-ups, and things like that, which is, I think that's a valid criticism when you really think about it. It's one thing to have them where they're good in the ring and where they can breathe and have their cardio's up, but it's another thing to be so reliant on that you're not teaching them how to properly do things. Because when you don't have a guy who's able to do something properly and you train them to, he can do 1,000 push-ups, cool, but he can't do a move properly, you end up with things like, well, unfortunately what happened in December of 1999 where Bill Goldberg kicked the career out of Bret Hart, quite frankly. Kicked him in the head with a stiff kick. Now, it was a freak accident. It was one kick. Goldberg at that point had been wrestling for about 2 years. But it's one of those things where how often could that have been, how many things could have been prevented if guys were more, here's how you properly do a move, here's how you properly put things together, than how many push-ups did you do today? How many squats did you do? How many, it's just, you have to balance it. And one of the biggest criticisms of the power plant was they didn't balance those two things. The Tank would in addition to the people I mentioned before, the WCW power plant would put out talent, some of these I say loosely, Tank Abbott, C.W. Anderson, who's actually very good, Luther Biggs, Shark Boy, Sick Boy, Scott Vick, who became Sick Boy in the WCW in the Flock, Raven's group in the Flock, was a trainee who became Sick Boy. Chad Brock, who was if I remember correctly, he was a guy who was he was a low-level like country music star, trying to be a country music star, and then somewhere along the lines they started training him to be a wrestler, which never went anywhere, so that's weird. Keith and Kent Cole, who were the Cole twins. That's another name that, if you go back on the Cole twins, I remember them vaguely. Jason Cross, Scott D'Amore, David Flair. Well, clearly they, Chad Fortune, the Gambler. You remember the Gambler? Yeah, the guy who he was the king of worldwide. That's who the Gambler was. And there are many guys here like Glacier, Sam Greco, Kevin Green is another one where you're training a guy to get ready for a TV match. The match with Kevin Green and Steve McMichael versus Ric Flair and Arn Anderson. Well, Kevin Green trained, and he would actually have a couple more matches, but he would train at the power plant. Mentioned Van Hammer. Chris Harris, that's another story. This guy was in the tail end of WCW. He'd work in the power plant. He would become red-black security for Vince Russo and all these things, as would many other people. Horace Hogan, which that one surprised me because Horace Hogan actually was wrestling in Japan for a long time and then comes in to work in the power plant, which is sort of weird. Prince Iaukea, he became TV champion. Not a lot of huge stars here, but a guy, guys who, he was a TV champion. I think he was Cruiserweight champion once and things like that. So, he made it on TV at least. Chris Canyon. Chris Canyon's another one. That's a really surprising one, but very talented guy. But yeah, he came from there. Kenny Chaos, like I mentioned. Evan Courageous. Steve McMichael. Yeah, one of the most famous power plant graduates was Steve McMichael. They should have closed the shop up then. Ernest Miller learned pro wrestling. He was a world karate champion. Then he became a wrestler. He learned wrestling at the power plant. And I could go on and on and on. Guys who, some of them had backgrounds in wrestling. Some of them came off the street. But again, not a huge, there were some guys with talent here. Jimmy Yang is another one. Jimmy Yang would become a big enough, he would do pretty well for himself. He'd go to WWE and, he did pretty well for himself considering. They'd also produce female talent like Asia. Do you remember her? No. Daphne, Major Guns, which again, shut the doors. Gorgeous George, not that one. The Randy Savage's girlfriend at the time. That one. God. Stacy Keibler, truly 5-star matches. Deborah, Charmel, so on and so forth. A lot of, it's not a knock on the women. Really, there's a lot of these women, a lot of women that were trained there were basically, they were Nitro girls who were training to work matches because they got this idea in their head at one point that the Nitro girls needed to be part of the show, and so, blah, 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 blah. But there were some people that were trained, like Molly Holly, who came in and worked with them, and I believe Daphne was trained beforehand. I could be wrong, but I think that's the case. Medeja, Tori Wilson had no wrestling background. So again, they were women that were trained for some of the stuff they were going to do in the ring, but yeah, not a lot of huge talent there. Not a lot of major guys who would work there. AJ Styles famously would work there, but again, this was a couple of years before TNA would come along and they would actually do a lot with Mike Sanders. Now, this leads us to another criticism of the power plant. Well, they would often take guys who had a wrestling background and sort of fine-tune them. Guys like okay, Goldberg would come off the street, but guys like Chris Kanyon and many of these talents would come off of other schools, and they would like fine tune them and get them ready for television. They would also take people completely off the street, work them, and the biggest problem was there was a group in the end of the company's run. Like I've covered in another episode called Naturally Born. Check that one out. It's about a group, one of the last groups in WWE's history, called the Natural Born Thrillers. Natural Born Thrillers would be Sean O'Hare, Mark Jindrak, Sean Stasiak, Reno, Mike Sanders, Johnny the Bull, and they were talented guys. Very, now I'm not saying they weren't talented in their own way. The biggest problem was, quite frankly, none of them were ready for television. Johnny the Bull came in, I believe, Johnny the Bull actually I think came in first because he was part of the Mamalukes tag team with Vito, who Vito was actually a legit, he was Skull Von Crush all the way up through the early 90s. So he was a good guy to put him with. But yeah, I mean, a lot of, they put these guys together and they were this big group, and Mike Sanders was a great talker, not a great worker, but he was, a great talker, absolutely a great talker. Sean O'Hare had promised, Mark Jindrak had promised, but what it was a few guys that had been, at that time, if I remember correctly, some of them had been training for about 6 months. They had done 6 months at the power plant, which admittedly was not necessarily a great school, not known for putting out high-end talent, and then, you're ready for television. And let's put them in a group, and let's make Mike Sanders commissioner, let's put him with Kevin Nash, let's put him with Terry Funk, and all these different guys. And the criticism was guys were getting called up too soon. Goldberg was caught on like wildfire. Goldberg came in, he'd done the power plant, they brought him in, he started steamrolling everybody, and it caught on like gangbusters. And you can't really criticize that. The Natural Born Thrillers on the other end, while, again, many of them had potential, but the idea that they were going to be the next big thing in the business, many of them were too green. They were working, they were winning the tag team titles, and they were, top guys. Chuck Palumbo is another example. I don't know why I forgot him. Chuck Palumbo, who had a background. He'd actually been wrestling as AAA. No relation to Triple H, just called him AAA. But he'd been working, and he'd done job work for him, but these guys were just not ready for the position they were put in. And again, if you're running a training camp and you're running a school connected to a promotion, theoretically, you should call guys up when they're ready. Now, I'm not saying the Performance Center doesn't do that. I'm not saying WWE doesn't do that now. There are guys who are brought onto TV, quite frankly, on NXT right now. There are people on NXT that maybe could use a little more work. I still don't understand Lacey Evans. Lacey Evans went on NXT. I didn't like what she was doing. She got called to the main roster. I still don't get it. Sorry. That's just my opinion on the matter. Gonna get a little modern with you. But, it's not that it's not gonna happen, but this was like doing it with 7 people at the same time. 7 wrestlers thrown together in a group and were made, quite frankly, that last year of WWE's existence, they were one of the main storylines. You had the rise of Booker T and the rise of Scott Steiner, and you had whatever crazy thing Vince Russo was doing. But then on the other end, you also had guys like Kevin Nash and Diamond Dallas Page working against, or with, depending, these 7 rookies who had been in the business, who had been around for maybe 6 months, and all of a sudden they're the main feature of television. And again, not to say Mike Sanders wasn't a good talker, but anytime you put him in the ring, it was a WCW Saturday night regular old match. So that's one of the major criticisms of the WCW power plant, is that, quite frankly, especially near the end, they were bringing people up that were just too quick. They weren't ready for it, and that was kind of a problem when you really think about it. The WCW power plant would run until literally the end of the company. With when the WWF purchased WCW, they purchased everything from the banners that were hanging there to, I think they purchased everything but the building. I'm pretty sure the building was being rented, but they purchased everything WCW, including the power plant, which effectively put the power plant out of service. Because, as I said, the WWF had a developmental system at the time, which I said at some point I'm going to do a whole episode just on the developmental system, on the kind of the history they went through. But they still had one. They had a developmental system. They had, I believe it was HWA and OVW at the time. And the talent that were, even some of the people that were in WCW in the power plant were sent to HWA and OVW. They were sent there, and the power plant and everything was shut down. After the WWF purchased WCW, thereby dissolving the power plant, former trainer Dwayne Bruce would open his own wrestling school called the Super Power Plant, because why not, in Jasper, Georgia, and worked with a local promotion. Some other WCW power plant trainers, including Jody Hamilton and Paul Orndorff, joined the WWA4 Pro Wrestling School staff in Atlanta. Dwayne Bruce would eventually join the staff after his school closed. The WWA4 is still in operation to this very day, so that's pretty cool. So ultimately, what is the legacy of the WWE Power Plant? Quite frankly, it's not good. I think in the future, when you look at pro wrestling and you look at trainers and camps and all these things, I think when you look at WWE, even the developmental system, there is a history of really great talent. I mean, of course, OVW, you had the Big Four. You had Brock Lesnar, Randy Orton, Batista, and John Cena, all coming out of OVW. Now, of course, they had different training backgrounds. John Cena, of course, trained at UPW. Randy Orton was trained in OVW, but had a pedigree that was just unmatched. So, but it's still, when you look at OVW, there's so many talent that came out of there, and even guys like HWA, and even all these different promotions. The Performance Center is on that list of putting out a lot of great talent, people who had no background in wrestling, and some who had some, but were fine-tuned and taken and put in that WWE style and taught the right way, and that eventually got them on television. The story of the WWE Power Plant, quite frankly, it's unique, and I liked to do this episode about it. I wanted to look into it because I thought about these comparisons, but the actual comparisons of talent were not that great. There were even guys like Big Show, or Paul White, the Giant, what have you, who was put in a position with Hulk Hogan in his first match. He trained at the Power Plant, but it wasn't necessarily that he was taught, many of the talent, including him, including guys like Mark Jindrak, were talked about, they didn't really feel like they learned the business. They didn't really learn how to do things properly until they ended up in the WWE system, until they ended up at a real school or a real developmental, and felt like that the Power Plant was sort of lacking in a lot of ways. Molly Holly, Nora Greenwald, whatever you want to call her, same deal. She trained at Dean Malenko's school, and she went from Dean Malenko's school and then came to the Power Plant, and she remarked that it was more about, doing sit-ups and getting yelled at than it was actually learning how to wrestle. And she had done the Malenko school, so of course she learned how to wrestle. Is the Malenko school. I mean, come on now. So if you look at WCW, it's very unique to WCW. If you look at the Power Plant, you would see a lot of the people that worked there, who trained there, ended up on WCW television. Like I said, Robbie Rage and Kenny Chaos were high voltage. Hardbody Harrison, Hard Work Bobby Walker, Ron Reese had numerous different gimmicks over the years. And all these different guys, Sean Stasiak, Sean O'Hare, Mark Jindrak, Reno, Johnny the Bull, Mike Sanders, Kwee-Wee, who a guy I didn't really mention here, Elix Skipper. There's a lot of guys who were, if you look at WCW in the late, in their final year, 2 years, you're seeing a lot of influence of the WCW Power Plant. Now, whether that's good or bad is really debatable, because while you had an influx of new talent, a lot of the new talent weren't prepared for the spots they were given, and that overall hurt the product. The legacy of the company is, Power Plant is mostly known for, like I said, being a place where a jobber, a low-level guy like Dwayne Bruce, was put in charge of people and was more concerned about how many sit-ups you can do instead of whether or not you can actually do your craft well. And that kind of mentality, if you run your own school, you can do whatever you like. If you're running if you're running a training school that's supposed to get people ready for television, you're not doing your job. So the Power Plant is considered by many to be a flop, considered to be something that didn't make the company money, didn't produce a whole lot of stars. Like I said, Goldberg, you could argue Page, you could argue a couple guys that were, the stars, but really, honestly, it produced 2 or 3 guys. And it existed for, officially from 1995 to 2001. And during that time, you produce what you could argue is 3 guys who are ready for television and put in a top spot, and very few of them are still in the wrestling business this many years later. I know Mark Jindrak is, Marco Corleone in Mexico, who I've covered in the Natural Born Thrillers episode. Guys like that, when your job is to get people ready, and you, quite frankly, at the end of the day, you sort of crap the bed, and you, for years and years and years, and you're the official training. If the Performance Center right now was putting out one good talent in all the time that it's had, when the Performance Center was built, if they produced by this point 1 person on the main roster, that'd be considered a failure. WWE would have shuttered it years ago, but WCW let it go, and that was sort of, I don't know if it was something with out of sight, out of mind, I don't know, but it didn't quite do the job it was intended to do, and that's ultimately going to be the legacy of WCW Power Plant. Something that was very unique, something that looked different. I mean, at the time, this was a year before the Performance Center was even a thought. And it was a great idea, but I think the execution is where it failed. So that's going to do it for this time. I always thought this was very unique. I liked stuff that's unique in pro wrestling. I like listening to, thinking of things that are, not necessarily what's going on in the ring, certainly not what's going on with the modern product. I'll be honest with you, a lot of the modern product kind of bores me, but I look at looking back and some of the most unique things in pro wrestling. So thank you for listening. Thank you for taking your time out of your day to listen, and I have fun doing these episodes, and we have some other stuff coming up. I recently filmed something with Ray McGuff, and we look at some of the crappy wrestling and sort of make commentary on it. I know it's not a new concept, but it's us, and we're going to have fun with it. We had a lot of fun filming it, so give us a try. I don't know if that's going to be a whole episode, and not necessarily an episode. It could be an extra thing, but it's going to be fun, and it's going to be unique, so look out for that. If that's not already out yet, look out for that. But that's going to do it for this time. Until next time, my name's Dan, this Exploder. Have a good one.
You want to cry? You want to feel pain? Take it to the power plant. What did you say to me?